I don't think it's so much the variant as the reaction and response to it. I mean, as we know from the doctor in South Africa that actually identified it, she is very shocked at British response to it by ministers because she described it as having seen mild symptoms. And yet there's been a knee-jerk reaction that has imposed restrictions such as mask wearing, which no one's quite clear, is not consistent, and not everywhere, but also what is the efficacy of mask wearing. But then on the one hand, some people say don't have socializations, but then at the same time, the government are saying we're not saying stop Christmas parties. All of this, because of everything we've seen in the last 20 months, has meant that if you've got a business, on the one hand, you get very concerned, and also the public are on tenterhooks. So many big companies and small ones have had their either experienced cancellations or they're cancelled all their big events. So they might have smaller get-togethers, but this is really problematic. It's had an enormous impact because this is the time of year generally where people make some of the money back, but particularly after all the lockdowns and the damage, those that have survived, you know, hundreds of thousands of jobs have been lost, tens of thousands of venues. Those that have survived are now being hit with a double whammy. Obviously, venues, but also, you know, hotels and the travel industry. This is really problematic, and it's also very problematic generally for the public. When Chris Whitty has said that we should be living with this like the flu and getting on, he had his initial reaction and response was that this is not too much of a concern. Now we've seen, because we've had so long of this kind of hyper almost hysteria around anything that has the C word, we're seeing that this is having huge impact on the bottom line and on the public, and we really need to get back to normal now. That's why we encourage people to sign the togetherdeclaration.org and have their voices heard.
I think perhaps you might be seeing this, obviously you're seeing this from the eyes of somebody who's in hospitality, but you just pick up on a couple of things that you mentioned there. You said that the South African doctor said it seemed to be milder, but we have to bear in mind that South Africa have a much younger population, so they haven't yet seen the major adverse effects, but on the sort of age groups that who are ending up in hospital, it's not been such an awful thing for them. And also you mentioned it being a knee-jerk reaction. What if the government hadn't done this? Because if you were to detach yourself from the hospitality industry and think about what happened at the very beginning when people were complaining that the government didn't respond fast enough, what would you say they should be doing then and should be saying?
I think it's really important to have a balanced view. In fact, the Prime Minister said several times that it was going to be balanced and proportionate. We now have 90% vaccinated. We've now had another 13 million with a third boost. We were originally told it was 15 million jabs to freedom. The elderly and the vulnerable, was the original concern. This has gone so far now, and actually we've got millions of people waiting in the NHS for treatment: cancer, heart disease, stroke, sepsis. Lines of people waiting for everything from opticians to the dentist. We have enormous problems to solve. And the way that gets paid for on the one hand is by having our economy open. But the impact and the damage to society and health generally of taking this approach that basically has a very precautionary principle, right? The precautionary principle. And you say, well, we don't know what's going to happen, so therefore we're going to have this knee-jerk reaction. Chris Whitty's initial response was the right one. And like he said, we should live with this like the flu. We've got enormous issues to deal with. Had the government come out and said, well, look, we're going to assess this and evaluate it as it goes down the road. They also said in South Africa they think the vaccines deal with it. We're being told that we're not sure if the vaccines do deal with it, but then go and have a booster. The messaging is all over the place. And quite frankly, it's not just because I've had a whole history in hospitality. I'm talking also as a citizen that wants to see our freedom and our society back. We need to get back together with one another,
Alan,
our families, our friends, loved ones. And that's why we say be together.
Alan, I was going to say, though, but you mentioned the booster, but the booster was something that people were going to do anyway to sort of update their current protection from the original variant before even Delta. So the booster was just a booster and protection because I think the health professionals felt that your immunity would be waning after a period of time. So, you know, and can you blame the government for changing plans when they learn something new? So in this case, it's a new variant. They're not sure yet. Aren't they? I mean, do you not think that Boris Johnson may have struck it correctly in that he's not actually having the knee-jerk reaction that you're saying? They are saying don't cancel things just yet and just go as we are. Isn't that what's happening?
I think
it's
he
the
got
public
it
who are
wrong.
doing the
I think
cancelling
he
of
got it
things.
wrong because, well, also there's no discipline in the party because you have members of ministers and others making comments about no socialisation. You have to be clear about your messaging on the one hand. But let's be clear, there are going to be many variants. There are often thousands of them. And actually what happens is when they spread wider, particularly with a country that has so much immunity, both from having had COVID and from vaccinations, there's going to be many variants. If we start imposing restrictions every time we know that there's going to be a variant, even though we've had the majority of society vaccinated and we have very big immunity from people who've had COVID, we are never going to get out of this situation. So actually, you can't say on the one hand, we're going to impose these restrictions, it's a real concern, but carry on and have Christmas parties, and then have other people around you saying, well, actually, we're cancelling our parties. It's completely inconsistent. Whatever was done at the start, very little was known at the start. We've now had 20 months. We have a situation, if you look at the numbers of hospitalizations and others, that the numbers have been going down consistently. And, you know, we've got to get a sense of proportion here. People need to now be back to normal. That's what the government should be saying. They should be saying, look, we've had a great success with, you know, the elderly and the vulnerable being vaccinated. Let's get back to normal. Let's be open and robust. If we're constantly living in fear, it's going to be a disaster for society. And we're really encouraging people to get involved and say together, they'll sign the togetherdeclaration.org and have their voices heard with their MPs. Actually, next week, we've got a week of action about that. So people get to let their MPs know. We want to be back to normal. We don't want impositions. The 3 nations have got vaccine passports. There's no need for them. They make no sense. And, you know, similarly with a mask mandate and imposing these things, makes no sense at this juncture.
Well, I mean, some might say, Alan, that the masks do make sense because they would reduce your ability to spread if you did have COVID.